The World Ends With You on the Nintendo DS, which I played on my 3DS, and that's why this video looks like this. Just something I'm trying out once, since I don't have access to my PC right now, because if I did, I'd probably just have recorded DS emulator footage. But regardless, I played this game because I have always been curious to check out this sort of cult classic of the Nintendo DS, and because of the announcement of a new game coming to the Switch, I wanted to be prepared for it. So why the DS version and not the already existing remake version on the Switch? Well, mostly because there seems to be a lot of mixed feelings about that version. And in fear of ruining my first experience with this game, I decided to just play it safe and play the DS version, the original version. But yes, I do plan on playing the remake as well, just don't expect it anytime soon. So let's actually begin this review, starting with the story. The World Ends With You is set in Shibuya and focuses on these kids and teenagers who recently died and now have to play a game with a series of odd objectives set by some sort of game master with the prize for surviving and winning players. The prize, from what I understand, is whatever you wanna ask, but given you're dead, you can guess what most people are asking for. Now, from this description, you know it probably sounds exactly like the plot to the manga Gantz. And aside from gore and nudity of Gantz, they do share a lot of similarities in themes. But I'll never say one is copying another when The World Ends With You is going for a much more stylized world with a different message or messages, addressing things more like fashion and the art of self expression or how these affect each other. And this is actually done fairly subtly here, and it's impressive. The main story of this game may not be the most original thing ever, and if you ever watched an anime, you've probably seen a story like this, but it's a story that ends up being greater than the sum of its parts, and to me, its style and the little details you see throughout the story is what pushes it to be much more impactful than this story would otherwise be. And for that, I think it makes it stand among other similar stories, and fair to say that I really enjoyed it. Moving on then to the gameplay, this is probably the most original piece of this game. This being a DS game, it sure takes advantage of it. Being an action RPG, the combat of the game will span across both screens. Playing as the main character Neko, you control him and his attacks with the touchpad on the bottom screen, and control his partner, which will change throughout the game for plot reasons. But I'll say when they do change that they do stick around for a while, meaning you do have an incentive to level them up and upgrade them and equip them with items. But before we talk about those, let me explain the combat that may seem rather complicated from the outside, and it is a little bit, especially when you first start the game, but it soon becomes a rhythm. The reason for this is because there's a light puck that gets passed around from screen to screen that multiplies damage, and the idea is that you should be focusing on the screen that the puck finds itself in. This puck changing from screen to screen after a successful combo, which you have an incentive to do as fast as possible, because the faster you do it, the higher the multiplier on the puck. Now, to explain this gameplay a little bit more, because it really doesn't play like any mainstream game out there, there is a bottom touchscreen, of course, where you control Neko, like I said before, by dragging him around with the stylus. Doing things like, for example, grabbing Neko and doing a fast drag creates a dodge movement. Then attacks work by performing certain moves or patterns on the touchscreen. Things like slashing an enemy to attack, or drawing a circle to create an area attack, or make a line across the screen to create a barrier. And what you can do in combat is determined by the pins you're wearing. These being the main mechanic of the game, the pins will be obtained throughout the game through various means, like simply progressing the story or buying them, or them dropping from enemies, for example. You can initially only wear a few pins, but by the end of the game you can where up to 6 pins, assuming you upgrade them. These also happening somewhat through the story, but if you want all 6, you need to actually go and find the stickers that allow you to unlock those pin slots. These also being found in stores, but I'll talk about the stickers more in a bit. You can also level up the pins to make them stronger by simply using them, or also leaving the game off. Yes, there is an incentive here not to play the game, as the more days you spend without playing, the more PP you will receive when you turn on the game once again. PP being the XP for these pins, and yes, I don't know how to say it any other way. Surprisingly, this is a good mechanic because as someone who didn't really have the liberty of just letting my game off for a week because, well, I need to write this review, this is a game that is helped by taking breaks. Mostly because of the gameplay and how surprisingly physically involved it is. For starters, you want to preferably be playing this game with a stylus, and playing with the small Nintendo DS stylus will be not so much tiring as more cramping to your hand, making it uncomfortable to play more than a few hours. Remember that this is not a game where you press buttons to attack. You actually have to draw the attacks and you're constantly drawing, and it's like an aggressive drawing, right? And I think that's why this is probably a game that's pretty uncomfortable to play for more than a few hours. Adding to this is also the fact that you have to, with the other hand, to tightly hold on to the console, which regardless of the console size or weight, it's gonna be tiring regardless. Preferably, if you were to sit down and play this game for a long period of time, you would want to do it on a table where you can place the DS or 3DS on it, and remembering at least to just stretch your fingers once in a while, since having your hand in that holding a tiny pencil position that the Nintendo stylus forces you to is not particularly comfortable. That being said, praise also has to be given that this game is very accommodating to both right-hand and left-handed people, as the face buttons A, B and XY will also work as the D-pad, which leads us to talk about the top screen gameplay, where you control whoever is your partner at the moment. And while each partner has their own style of combo system, the core is fundamentally the same. You push the D-pad in a certain order to create an attack, and when you have the light puck, you can create a symbol depending on the attack. Gathering a certain number of these symbols in a certain order will allow you to do a special attack. Or you can save them up and create an even stronger special attack. It seems simple, but it is a little bit complicated. But you do also just get used to it, and as you play the game, of course, it becomes a lot more natural. And even if you can't get used to it, there's an option that makes the top screen borderline play itself, which is a nice accessibility option. This being an option that is in the main menu, where you can basically set how long you want before the top screen starts to move by itself, with the max one being immediately and the lowest one being manual, where you can probably guess the character never moves on its own and it's always waiting for your input. Now the option right next to this one is the difficulty option, which here it's more like a mechanic than an actual difficulty to set once and never change, as some of the enemies will only drop certain items on certain difficulties, which means in some situations you literally have to change the difficulty to be able to acquire a certain item that might be mandatory to complete a certain quest. Speaking of quest, let's now talk about the world and how it's laid out, it being sort of a semi-open world game where you have a map of Shibuya and you can travel anywhere as long as the missions and the game allow it. Basically, certain parts of the map are not immediately unlocked at the beginning of the game, and then certain areas can close up again depending on what's going on with the story. This meaning certain areas and subsequently stores are only available periodically, which adds a certain level of urgency if you want a very specific item, but towards the end of the game, this map opens up a lot more, often diminishing this urgency. Also, now that we're talking about the stores, we have to address the equipable items, as they work a bit weirdly here. As while you can always see their stats, you don't know what their special abilities are immediately, needing to build up trust with store owners by buying more from them. This is a bit of a weird mechanic, and I think it mostly exists to make you stick with only a few brands throughout the game, because of the next mechanic of this game, what I call the fashion mechanic. Basically, each area of the map has a certain brand of clothes and pins that are trendier than others, meaning that in those areas, those items of that brand are boosted in power, giving you a reason to change around pins rather than just stick with what works for you. But something that does help you keeping with one type of playstyle is how if you use a majority of a certain brand and then battle in an area for a certain amount of time, then you can change what's trendy in that area to whatever majority brand you're wearing. And this also plays a little bit into the story, as clearly what you're doing in this game is affecting the real world in some way. And that's cool, even if it makes the gameplay a bit too overcomplicated sometimes, especially when there is already so much going on and this is already not the easiest game out there. Now, speaking of how the gameplay and combat actually present themselves in this world, and as I mentioned in the story, you're playing a game after you died, and so the people of Shibuya who are alive cannot see you. Only other players and people controlling the game can. That being said, you can still interact with things in the world, including certain stores, meaning that, like I said in the fashion segment, you can affect things in the real world, leading to somewhat simple puzzles that are quite interesting in the way they work with the story. But more about that in a bit. Now, how you get into fights works with a pin that is very connected to this whole story. It's a pin that not only allows you to read people's mind, but also introduce thoughts into people's mind as part of those puzzles that affect the real world. This pin is always equipped and it's not used for fighting, as it is something a bit important to the story. But what I really wanted to say about it is that it also allows you to get into fights. Basically, once you click this pin, you can go into a state where you can read people's mind, but also see the monsters wandering around. Here represented by stickers floating around, and you can click on them to start a fight. You can also click on multiple at a time to start a chain combat, having you do multiple fights in a row, this being incentivized for adding bonus rewards at the end of the fight, but also allowing you to pull higher special attacks, since progress of those levels and symbols of the special attack save between these chained encounters. But of course, being a lot harder at the price of your health not replenishing between these back-to-back fights like it usually does. Then later on in the game, a new certain type of harder enemy will show up that chases you and can force you into a fight or chain fight, adding to the difficulty. If I can give one complaint though, is how after you die you go back to the main menu, but only for the first few hours of the game until being able to repeat the fight, and in some cases even being able to just go before the fight happened. Why this isn't there from the beginning is beyond me, and I surely lost a couple of hours because of it. So be sure to save your game often, especially in the early bits of the game. The final type of item then, that is the food. This can be bought like other items via money or completing quests, or with quest items, these being rarer items that can be used at the stores to also trade for rarer items. But my advice here is be frugal with these, as sometimes something that uses rare items in one store just uses money in another, especially with food items, and also because a lot of these rare items are legitimately rare and you don't want to be wasting them. The food items then work much like clothes in a way that you equip them in the menu, but this working with squares, meaning that a certain food will have more squares than others depending on their effect, and you can only eat a certain amount before you are full, and you have to wait for the next chapter to eat again. But also, you can't just eat more than an item at a time. As you equip a food item, these squares will grayed out as you fight, and only once all of these have completely grayed out can you eat another food item, assuming you have enough space for it. It's like a hunger system, except you do it to raise your stats and not because you actually need to eat to survive. Something I forgot to mention about the clothing and fashion system was also the bravery stat. Basically, certain clothes need a certain level of bravery to be used, and this adds another layer of complexity to the clothing system, which, is already somewhat complicated, but that's fine. And raising bravery can be done through leveling up, but mostly through eating food that gives you bravery, which isn't the most realistic concept, but at least the game isn't advocating for not eating or something. Regardless, final thing I want to talk about gameplay wise is the Tin Pin Slammer minigame. This is a surprisingly fun game, and it shows up in a few side quests of this game that has you sliding pins around trying to knock your adversary pins off the stage, with each pin having a certain number of the 4 special attacks, which I'm not gonna go too deep into because of it being just a mini game, but it is surprisingly fun and addicting, and it even has a multiplayer mode, even if that may be a bit hard to pull off nowadays given you need people with this game. In fact, there are quite a few multiplayer features here, including some mimicking the Street Pass on the 3DS, except this came out first. But I'm not reviewing these because, well, I didn't get to experience them. And even back in the day, I have a hard time believing that I could walk around with a DS in my pocket and find other people with this game on. It's definitely something that was probably only really used or got used in Japan, where I imagine this game was a lot more popular around its launch. But thankfully, it's also not something incredibly needed for the gameplay. You're not missing out on something big for not having it work. Regardless, it's a very complex set of systems, making for a very unique action RPG and a very unique game in general. And hopefully my explanation made sense, especially since this time we lack a visual reference for it. Now, moving on to the graphics, this is also a very unique looking game in that regard, with very cartoony and anime designs with thick black outlines and hard shadows with skinny and long characters, and of course a big focus on fashion and characters' clothes, looking very out there in some situations, with a lot of chains, because this is, after all, a Square Enix game. There isn't any game quite like this, and if you see this game, you probably know it. The mix between that Square Enix look and the more cartoony style is not only unique, but also ends up being important to the game, with some of its themes with clothing and fashion being part of them. Fair to say, I really like it, and I think most people will, even if the fact everyone is so skinny can be a bit weird for some people, but hardly a complaint. Finally, sound-wise, this game is very catchy with a very poppy and colorful sound, but it can also be very repetitive in a way that it ends up finding itself in that situation where you hear so much of the same song and it's so catchy that it's stuck in your brain and you have a bit of a love-hate relationship with it. In my experience, it's kinda like some songs in Persona games, and I think to understand that this is a bit of an inherent problem with long RPG games, as no one is making that much music for their games, and I'm not gonna hold it against it, it is a bit unrealistic. Finally then, I've been very positive of this game, and I mean it. It is a very unique looking game, and a very unique playing one as well. There isn't anything quite like it out there, and that's good, which is important, and I'm giving The World Ends With You an 8 out of 10. It was kinda hedging out a 9, but the checkpoint system only showing up hours into the game with very little reason for coming so late, and the menus can be a bit of a hassle to navigate through sometimes. And of course, how hand cramping it is and how hard it is to play for long periods of time did push down the experience for me a little bit. I do understand that it is a me problem and having to review the game, but that's my experience and that's what I have to review. Regardless, it's still a game I hardly recommend. In terms of recommendations though, I would say if you have a DS or 3DS and some easy access to the game, then go for it. But realistically, this isn't the cheapest game on the DS, unfortunately. And unfortunately as well, DS is a console that is full of reproduction or fake cartridges on the market, which I do not recommend getting, honestly. I would say that if that's the route you're planning on taking, then I think you're better off using a flash card instead. For those who don't know, flash cards on the DS at least are basically just Nintendo DS cartridges that allow you to put an SD card in it and play ROMs, basically. You can also just play it on an emulator, which the DS is fairly easy to emulate actually nowadays. But given this is also heavily based on the touchscreen, I'm not sure how that would translate to trying to use a mouse, so be aware of that. There is also a Switch remake of this game, but as far as I'm aware, it is borderline a different game, gameplay wise, and I want to try it before I recommend it. So, maybe expect a review at some point. Now, for people who are against emulation and or piracy, who might be angry right now, while I do understand your point of view, I would like to say that for this game specifically, in its original form, at this time, it isn't possible to buy in any official way new, since they don't make any more cartridges and the game is not on the Nintendo eShop. And I'll say that my stance is that there's very little difference between buying a used game and downloading a ROM of it, as long as the game plays the same, which it usually does. Which you can disagree with, and that's fine, but that's where I stand. Regardless though, I hope this video was helpful in your decision to play this game, and regardless of that, I hope you enjoyed watching this, or in this case more like listening. But regardless, if you did, please consider subscribing and liking and even leaving a comment, all things you can do for free here on YouTube. And regardless of that, I hope you're having a good day, and goodbye.